You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am really excited. I'm talking to Joan Fernandez, the author of a new novel, but it's kind of historical fiction based on Jo van Gogh. So we're going to get some insights into one of my all-time favorite artists, Vincent van Gogh, but from a whole different lens. Joan, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm thrilled to be here, Kyle, especially to talk to another Van Gogh fan.
Oh, absolutely. It's like one of the only things that divides my household, because Van Gogh is one of my all-time favorites and was my favorite artist from like high school. I remember going to see his work when the Art Institute had a big exhibition, and my wife has always been like, he's overrated. Which I like, there's a fair criticism that nobody's worth that much hype, but I always have loved Vincent. But I think this is really interesting. Your book, Saving Vincent, is largely about how the Van Gogh sort of mythology came to be. And you bring us into the world of Van Gogh, not through Vincent, but through Jo, his sister-in-law. And so right off the bat, I do want to say, for listeners, check the links in the show notes. I'm going to have the links, you can get the book. I highly recommend it. I was saying before I started recording, I'm really enjoying the book. I loved right from the start. It was like, I kind of know the story because I'm familiar with Van Gogh, but still just that dramatic tension had me hooked from the first chapter, as we see Jo sort of waiting for her husband Theo to get back and then getting the news that he has passed. And I'm not going to spoil too much, but I do want to eventually lead to a question here. Joan, I'm wondering, why did you pick Jo as a subject? Like, I want to start with her first. Like, what makes her a compelling figure to you?
Well, Kyle, I think that I first heard about Jo van Gogh on a trip, on a visit to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And this was prior to today. I know they have some specific exhibits and a biography out on her, but this was in 2016. And much like you're talking about, I was enthralled with Van Gogh. I went through the museum exhibit with one of those audio tours. So, he's in my head. And I get to the end of this tour after an hour, and I see this little notation with this little black and white photo of Theo Van Gogh's wife, Jo. And next to that notation is this fact that she inherited all of Van Gogh's artwork when Theo died. And then she spent the next, really her lifetime, promoting Vincent to be acknowledged as the tremendous talent and genius that he was. And I remember staring at her photo and thinking, if not for you, like, none of this would be here. I mean, it shocked me. And here's the connection. My professional career prior to retiring to become an author was I made my career in marketing. And I remember in corporate America, it's not, it's very familiar to many people how you can be ignored, how you can be passed over, you can not be acknowledged for ideas. And when I started to look into Jo, I saw similar forms of very subtle agency that she had to use to move forward in really a male-dominated industry. And so I sort of felt like I knew her story. I sort of felt like I'd lived and breathed kind of what she was up against. And it really pulled at me. So I decided that I would try to write her story.
Yeah. And so for listeners unfamiliar, so let's just set the scene here. It's the 19th century, right? Vincent van Gogh passed away, and in his lifetime, for listeners who want to learn more about this, I've covered Van Gogh a bit. I'll put links in the show notes, but a short version of this, he was not a commercially successful artist in his lifetime. There's the classic tale that he only sold one painting, or there's only records of him selling one painting, and fun fact, he gave a painting to his doctor from the asylum who used it to patch a hole in his chicken coop. So, today it's worth like tens of millions of dollars. But back in the 19th century, not so much. And Jo, she lost her brother-in-law, and then she lost her husband, Theo, and she's left to care for, I think it was one child, right? She had one
Right.
one child.
When Theo died, he was just a year old.
Yeah. And so just can you start to paint a picture for us? Like, what were the options that were available to her? Because, in different societies at different times, women had varying degrees of rights. So, like, what did her picture look like in terms of, like, the potential options to support herself and her son?
Well, there was an assumption that she would move back to Amsterdam to move in with her parents. So that was just that was just an assumption that there was no way she would be living on her own. And in fact, her brother Dries suggested that she be put under a conservatorship. So there was that against her, just simply the momentum of family expectations. Her older sisters were looking forward to helping to raise the baby. She was, her father was ready to pack up her goods and move them. So that was against her. Secondly, women were not a part of commerce at her in a middle and as far as a middle class goes. Like if she was lower class, it would be typical. She could be a shopkeeper. She could do some things like that. But as a middle class woman, it was not. Once again, no doors were open to her. Art commerce itself was a man's world. And even at that time, there were these physiological beliefs that women had smaller brains, that they were not as, they were fragile. They didn't have as much resilience. In fact, Jo has in her own history, when things would happen, it was expected that she would lie down. And so there was this sense of women didn't have the stamina. And I want to share the art dealing industry at that time was Paris was the epicenter for thousands of young men and artists that were coming into the city to make their mark. It was almost like today's Silicon Valley with app developers. They just flooded that place. So what happened were all of these little cottage industries sprung up, like Van Gogh went to Frank Corman, I think was the name of the artist that had a little studio in Paris. He went to for a while. There were all of these, Julien Tanquy, who was a Theo and Vincent's friend. He has the portrait that was painted, Père Tanquy. He was a paint merchant. He also sold art paintings on the side. So this was a dog-eat-dog environment for art dealing. It was the big type of industry, and there were some real top-tier dealers who ultimately Jo got to sell Van Goghs. But it was ridiculous to think that she could make any headway in this type of a crazy, chaotic street fight when it came to bartering and dealing in art. It would have been inconceivable. And so that was an enormous societal headwind. So do you want to give away what she did? She didn't take door number 1 or door number 2.
I mean, I don't want to give too many spoilers for the book, but, obviously we need to craft a little bit of this narrative. So how did she navigate the world as she was doing it? And, you talk about it being a rough and tumble world with the art dealers all competing against each other. But Theo had been an art dealer, which obviously there were family connections in there. I believe the Van Gogh family, if I recall my research correctly, like Vincent had been in that trade. His uncle, I think, had been in that trade. So I'm wondering, did they have family friends who were helping them or helping her to navigate that world? Or was it like, well, Theo and Vincent are gone, so good luck?
I think, well, the uncle that you're speaking of, his name was actually also Vincent van Gogh, and he was the partner of the dealership that Theo was a manager for. It was named Goupil at that time, and then it ultimately changed its name to Boussard and Valadon. But he had passed away by the time Jo was in the picture. Theo did have that family connection, but Theo was also given a gallery in Montmartre, which was where Toulouse-Lautrec was hanging out, and Claude Monet and Camille Pissarro, and names, the Impressionist names that we know of. But as far as Paris was concerned at the time, that was not Rue Lafitte. That was not École des Beaux-Arts. That was, that was way out there. And in fact, Theo was a tremendous advocate for modern art. He could really see the future, but he was ahead of the times. So those connections did not prove to be the ones that gave Jo help, but she did get help, but just not from them.
Okay, so that's interesting. So she had to get help from other sources.
Yes.
And so what did that look like? What did it look like as she was doing this? Did she just like sit there and think, okay, what's the story? What's the biography that's going to sell these works? That like, was she doing a traditional like marketing plan and scheme, or did it arrive a little bit more organically? Can you just walk us through a little bit of that?
Sure. No, I'd be happy to. I want to share just really quickly the reason why Jo could step into Theo's shoes, because she grew up in that environment of thinking of herself much like society thought of women. We just sort of accept these roles that society tells us about. She had two things in her favor that enabled her to really get Vincent's art. One was she grew up in a family that her father was an industrialist. He made sufficient money that he bought music lessons and musical instruments for all 7 of his kids. He was a workaholic, but he was really into music. So Jo grew up with music. Later, that transferred into her earning, according to a biographer, the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in music. So she knew about this skill of abstract and thinking about emotional connection and expression and, kind of these less than concrete ideas, very similar to art. Then, when she and Theo became engaged, she stayed in Amsterdam. Theo went back to Paris. And what happened then, Kyle, was this incredible treasure trove of correspondence between the two of them. Mm-hmm. And they're really, in these letters, they're tender, vulnerable, funny. I mean, they're getting to know each other. And you know how when you write a letter, you can really kind of put your heart on the page because you don't have to look at somebody in the eye. And so Jo starts asking Theo about art. How do you look at art? How do you understand art? And so he was writing back how to understand Vincent, why he thought he was ahead of his time, why you have to let go of all the conventional training you have in order to be open to what he was trying to do, how it has to touch your soul. He used this expression, you have to look beyond the paint. And then, all right, so Jo is soaking this stuff up, and there's a lot of other fun stuff in there, like their wedding gifts and the wallpaper he's going to put in the apartment.
Can I ask you a question? Because this is just triggering something for me. Is there, she's writing to Theo, and he's talking about how to understand and appreciate Vincent. One thing that always struck me is how she must have felt, or I've wondered how she must have felt about the fact that Theo was supporting his brother who was not selling a thing. And Theo's given this stipend. He's paying for the little yellow house in Arles, and telling Gauguin, like, oh, I'll buy some of your works and I'll move some of your paintings. Just please go hang out with my brother. Like, they weren't like super rich. I mean, they had to feel that financial burden and that sacrifice. How did she feel about that, or was that just not addressed?
I never read anything of her, anything remotely close to resentment. I think one of the chapters in the official biography of Jo that comes from the Van Gogh Museum is entitled something about she marries Vincent too. Vincent was a part of the marriage contract. I do know that in her lifetime, she only met him 3 times. And one of those times, she made Vincent really upset. He was in Auvers-sur-Oise, and she brought up exactly what you're talking about. And I don't think it was her intention to make Vincent feel guilty, but it made him angry. And we know behind anger is fear, right? Will this financial lifeline stop? Because Theo was sending also money to his sister Will, as well as his mother, who by then was a widow. Mm-hmm. So he was supporting. I don't know that was really unusual. I think men in a firstborn men or employed men would support their female family members. But I have seen correspondence that Jo wrote to Vincent, and they are they sound like a new fiance of your brother, whom you haven't met me yet, but I love your brother, and I'm looking forward to meeting you. And she has this crazy letter she writes him the night that I know she will have their baby, because I know the date that their baby was born, and she's writing to Vincent saying we want to name him after you, and I hope that he's someone, or I don't know, I can't remember the specifics, but she's reaching out to him. And I know that a few hours later, she's going to have that baby. So that was a cool moment.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, but I wanted to share, she's having all this correspondence with Theo, and he also shares in those letters how much he yearns for someone just to share the stress of being in business. Goupil, his employer, kept pressuring him for quicker turnover, and he wanted to represent the modern art. He didn't want, the idyllic, historical scenes and the photographic realism sort of thing. He really believed in modern art, and so they were writing about what marriage would be, and it was really much more of a sense of partnership and sharing. So then, Kyle, I imagined, because Vincent was writing and sending rolls of paintings, right? I imagined once Theo and Jo were married, him opening the mail with her right there, him unrolling the canvases and talking about what he saw. He once wrote with the painting, The Potato Eaters, his sort of Vincent's initial breakthrough, that Theo wrote, I could hear the clogs on the laborer's feet, something like that. Like he finally felt like, click, Vincent sort of got how to. And so I imagine Jo almost in an apprentice role. And this to me was important because it helped answer the question, how later, after Theo was gone, and she had this worthless inheritance that she really wanted to make something of, how could she be so confident when others were not, that Vincent was a talent? Among the thousands of artists that were in Paris, how could she determine that he was really someone to watch? And so I looked for some of that, what would be formative in her experience. And that felt important to me because the reason it was important is because I really believe she had her own sense of agency versus simply wanting to follow up on Theo's ideas. At some
And
point, it had to be her motive.
yeah, and that seems like a great sort of cliffhanger for an ad break. So, after a short break, we're going to get into just how did she do that? What was that path like as she crafted the legacy that we know today? Welcome back. This week, I am joined by Joan Fernandez, the author of a new book, Saving Vincent. It is being released on April 15th, 2025. It is a historical fiction novel about Jo van Gogh. And I love that you're bringing in not just like some of this historical fact from the records that we have. And, you talked in the first segment about the letters that you've read, but also, your sort of knowledge of marketing and how that world operates as you spent decades in corporate America, in a marketing context. So I am really excited now to know, how did she market his work? Jo van Gogh, she inherits a collection of hundreds of paintings that most people consider worthless. What were the other obstacles that she faced, and how did she get past them?
Sure. Well, I would say one of the very first things she did was, and I'm going to use some modern terminology. So she created FOMO. And how did she do that? She created this fear of missing out initially by giving paintings to influential people. The first one was to Octave Maus, who was the director of a modern art group in Brussels, who had been really supportive. And so she gave him a painting. She gave a painting to Theo's doctor. But both of them, and then later, subsequently, other gifts under the stipulation that if she was giving them that painting, that they would loan them back so that she could also exhibit them. And once she did that, when the paintings came back, they had a little plaque next to them saying from the private collection of Dr. Van Eeden, with the idea that the onlooker would think, oh, well, that's interesting. This person has, look at the painting a little bit differently with the sense of, oh, this other influential person has it.
Okay, so she gives some swag to some influencers, and it creates
good terminology.
But that's interesting because it creates almost a different form of a seal of approval. Like I've talked in a previous episode about like the Paris Salon and stuff like that, and how these tastemakers could really make or break an artist's career by accepting or rejecting work from the exhibition that everybody looked to. And so she found almost like a backdoor way of doing that through, what we might call a more grassroots, or I guess astroturfed sort of uprising of people who are influential, sort of putting their name alongside Vincent and his work.
Exactly.
That's pretty clever.
Yes, and it was something that I think she was doing intuitively. And they weren't just random, like the second-rate stuff. These were like really good paintings that we would recognize today as being worth a ton of money. I'll tell you a second thing that she did that really looked like she did not know what she was doing is she took all of her paintings, all the paintings that were in her apartment, which numbered between 300 and 400. I've heard both numbers, but I do know there were 27 crates with 10 paintings, at least 10 paintings in each. She had all of those shipped back to the Netherlands, and she chose to move to a small town, not with her parents, but southwest of Amsterdam. And there, I think it's well known that she opened up a guest house. And one of the reasons she could do that is that was a typical occupation for widows. She put all those paintings up in her attic. And then instead of thinking about Paris as her focal point, she decided to focus on Dutch art dealers. And so she began this routine of reaching out through letters, writing letters, proposing exhibits, offering would they be willing to show, would they be willing to present something for sale, and really her focus was all on Dutch art dealers being supportive of a Dutch artist. And this was kind of in sync with the times because this was the time, Kyle, when this idea of, they called them nation states were forming, like the French were talking about what is really French. Well, the Dutch were doing the same thing. They had a big colonialism effort going on. They wanted to know what defines who is Dutch. And so she had more open doors for Vincent in her own homeland and in his own homeland than, let's say, in those crowded sort of street fight environment going on in Paris. And she was successful with that. She was able to create relationships that lasted for a long time in Rotterdam, in The Hague, in Antwerp, and in Amsterdam.
Oh, so that's interesting. So she's basically tapping into painting and art and culture as a signifier of identity, which probably makes for a more lasting connection for people. Like I've always said, and the premise of this entire podcast series is stories are how we make sense of the world. When we get things on that gut level, it sticks with us. It hits a little bit differently. And so she seems to be you're saying she tapped into like this fervor for like a national identity and like that Dutch artistry and cultural heritage, and to get him into that avenue, it sort of occupies a different space. It's not just like he's this brilliant modern artist, he's forward thinking. No, he's a Dutch artist.
It was like a foothold. I mean, I think she, as you know, her vision grew bigger to make him known beyond, Netherlands borders, but it gave her something too that was a little bit more under her control. And she also made a ton of mistakes. Like her initial shippings of paintings, she didn't put enough straw to protect the painting, so they were getting little holes and tears in them. And she was, I know, especially since we think of Van Gogh, but she was keeping lists and redoing lists and keeping, to just kind of keep track of where all these paintings were was really this huge new project management, crazy new thing that she was taking on. And remember, she's doing it on top of figuring out how to run a guest house. So that's cleaning and shopping and menu planning and, facilitating guests and all of that. So in a sense, it was so smart for her to just start smaller.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's two full-time jobs with a whole lot of logistics that, we mostly don't think about. I mean, just how to pack and ship a collection of works of art, like that's quite the ordeal in and of itself, let alone trying to create a market for a buyer who is going to take or exhibit that collection that you're trying to send off. And doing all of that is really difficult. And we've talked about some of her successful strategies, but you and I both know every good story needs a villain. So who stood in her way? And I know in your book, in Saving Vincent, it seems like you have sort of a composite figure. Am I right in that? Like, can you talk a little bit about, who were the human obstacles that she had to face, and how did she circumvent that? How'd she overcome?
Sure. As you're right, I actually plucked a little bit of negative stuff from each of the people who stood in her way, and I created one character for my novel because I just thought it would be a little bit more dramatic. When I went to the Van Gogh Museum a second time, kind of as a follow-up, I spoke with the director of research there, and I asked him, did Jo have like a singular enemy? And he said no. So I had to do this. But an example would be in Jan Veth, like a Dutch person, with a Dutchman or whatever would say Jan Veth. But Veth lived right down the road from Jo. He was an art critic, and he was Theo's friend, and his wife was Jo's childhood best friend. So lots of good connections there. But he, right off the bat, was really critical of Jo's involvement with trying to promote Vincent's work. He thought that Vincent's work was unfinished. He thought that he painted too fast. He thought that, it was not all that she was presenting it to be. He considered it to be really insignificant. And so it annoyed him that she was doing this promotional work, as though here he is an expert, and here's this single mom, wife of his friend, who's now trying to almost in a way be in his footsteps.
And that's interesting to me on a couple of levels, because on the one hand, the betrayal from the sense of betrayal from somebody that you considered a friend, who you considered to be like in your circle, that stings more than a stranger criticizing you. But then also, I think of, as you're talking about this, I'm just thinking about how people pigeonhole other people, from the critic's perspective. Well, who is she to be crafting this narrative? Who is she to say that his work is worthwhile? That's literally my job. That's my role. And she's not trained in this, and therefore her opinion is not valid. To be clear, I am trying to summarize the viewpoint. I am not endorsing that viewpoint. But that's really interesting framing, and the dynamics I find absolutely fascinating.
Well, you know what brought him around? It's interesting because it was also a marketing strategy that she had, and that was she gave him some of Vincent's letters. And Vincent, in his letter, I did read all 900 that the Van Gogh Museum offers as its collection. And in it, Vincent, in that whole collection of letters, you really get a sense of who is this individual behind the painting. And I think that's kind of a normal thing for us to think about today, who's the artist behind the painting. But at that time, it was not common. And so it was Jo reading the letters herself that enabled her to get a sense of who Vincent was, because remember, she only met him 3 times. And then her offering those to Jan to read, I think, was a factor in turning him around to start to look at the paintings in a slightly different way. She also used the letters really strategically, in that she was approached by a friend of Theo, Emile Bernard, who was also a friend of Vincent's. Emile wanted to run an article in an art magazine in Paris called Le Mercure. And he said to her, can you translate some letters and send some drawings? Well, she didn't just send a couple. She sent she hand-selected 10 drawings. She hand-selected the letters and the translations. And when those were sent to the editor said, I've got enough for 6 issues. And I don't know whether he made that decision initially, but the interest that came from the first issue definitely supported the idea of doing more. And what that did from a marketing point of view is it created awareness and curiosity. Because remember, there's thousands of painters and artists in Paris. And then here's this interesting person, and his letters can be very provocative and funny. And he said once, fame is like putting the lighted end of a cigar in your mouth. So anyway, letters is what turned Jan around, I think.
Well, and I think a lot of us feel that way. I think everybody who's a fan of Van Gogh's work, I think also just has this moment of, oh, Vincent. That's, you feel for that guy. And I think that largely comes from how many of us, started off before I read any of his letters or before I read a biography, it was these selected quotes. And, like there are so many of them out there that I think that really did craft a story and an image of this brilliant, tortured artist that I think for a lot of modern audiences became like the archetypal image of an artist, right? Like I trace a lot of that to Van Gogh because before that, a lot of artists were more like tradesmen almost, where it's like their job was to execute the work for the client, and we're going to get this done, like you're a freelancer, whatever. I mean, yes, you can go back to like Michelangelo convincing the Pope that like, nope, I'm painting the whole ceiling, not just the pendantives. And, like there were people who had visions and stuff, but I look at Van Gogh so much through the lens of his words and his talk about his philosophy of art and the story of his life and who he was as a figure just poured into the paint. And I think that's probably a good transition point. Once again, we're going to have a short break, and then I want to get into Jo crafted her story. And I want to get your thoughts on story and art and how we make sense of the past and all of the stuff that goes along with that. Now we're back again with Jo Fernandez, the author of Saving Vincent. And, this is a work of historical fiction. You talked about Jo van Gogh and how she crafted the narrative, but obviously you're crafting a story as well. And you're weaving together a whole lot of historical fact, but then trying to breathe some life into it. And I'm curious how you tackle that, how you think about the importance of story in making sense of history, and what you feel is important to keep truthful to the facts, and where you can take liberties to bring out a deeper truth, if you will, or make it resonate.
Gosh, Kyle.
I know it's like 10 questions in once. That's my style. I dump all the questions in, and then you pick what you want to actually answer.
Well, I think that art is really a rich area for expression and interpretation and understanding and kind of what's the human condition, because artists, I think, tend to be out there, out front, really expressing what they see and feel in sort of raw, terms. And so it was really intriguing to me to see how Vincent's art and the acceptance of it has become so big. And of course, there is a marketing machine behind it and plenty of money being made behind him. But it's become so big that it was Theo's name that also took the place of Jo's and really subsumed and pushed her into the shadows, as though this great success had to be credited to just his brother. And so that just as a fact, when it comes to history, what I think we all sort of intuitively know is that there are many, like you said, there are many sides to what the stories of events, many different stories that are coming out of marginalized people, of women, in other words, the stories that are not kind of the winner takes all point of view, but what are the other things happening around, different things that we see from history. So by ignoring these other sides of what was happening, we kind of skew our sense of where we came from. And we skew the opportunity to recognize that there's leadership and genius and talent across, the human, all of the human race. And so I saw an opportunity here to demonstrate agency, in a true story, but I also fictionalized a couple of components of it. In one of them, you pointed out the nemesis that I created, which is this composite. I wanted to make it really have people feel the sense of headwind that Jo must have had by entering a male-dominated field. And I know about this because the three different industries that I've been connected to as a female are all male dominated. And so you know that these different forces exist in society, and I wanted to show an expression of that and how despite all of it, she was able to be successful because she had lots of sponsors and allies along the way that did not agree with kind of the big sort of tidal wave of society. Am I making any sense?
Oh, you are making such perfect sense that like I don't even know what to say to that because you're already like beautifully covering all these ideas, and I'm just sitting here like a yes and so like I do want to just say, because it would be weird for you to talk about how wonderful your book is, but listeners, I do want to say, as somebody who has read a reasonable amount of different historical accounts and everything like that in preparation for the various episodes I've done, this book, Saving Vincent, I found really enjoying and compelling, despite the fact that I knew the broad strokes of the story. I already knew that, but by fictionalizing it a slight bit, you turned it from, you know, the bulleted list of names, dates, and events into something where I feel that human connection. Like my gut just dropped at various moments as I'm reading about, you know, the twists and turns. And like I said, I knew a fair amount of this. I knew some of these things that were going to happen. And still there was that tension. And what I think is most beautiful about it is I read this and I don't just feel like I understand what Jo did. I feel like I start to build some empathy. And I think that's what we really need more of, is not just an understanding of who did what, but that these were all real human beings with myriad goals and complicating factors and flaws and moments of brilliance and moments of just, you know, cringeworthy, you know, packing straw into a crate as you're loading up what are today priceless works of art. There's just so much to it. It's a much more rich narrative the way you're laying it out. And so that's why I would encourage listeners to not only read this book, but also to just get into the stories that make up our history and to make that human connection. Because I think, you know, you understand things differently when it hits you in the heart instead of the head. You know,
I love that.
And like I said, you unpacked it much more beautifully than I could. I felt like I was just rambling, but I do really love the book, and I love a good story, and I love anything about Vincent. And I thought the Jo van Gogh story was one that needed to be told because she really is a big part of how he became the figure we know him as today. Before we wrap it up, is there anything else you want to share as parting wisdom, thoughts, insights for any of us to consider?
Well, gosh, I love everything that you've just said. I mean, especially this idea of the more we know about these big names, the greater our empathy. And I just love that in so many ways across so many different historical figures and current figures too, for that matter. I'm curious to know, Kyle, if you have a favorite Van Gogh painting, and is there a story behind why that is a favorite?
So that's a tough one for me because on the one hand, I absolutely love the Starry Night because it was it's one of those memories from my teenage years, getting to see it in person in the museum, and it was just, the works in a book can never compare to the real thing where you can see the textures and everything like that. And for, I know a number of my art teacher friends listen, I will always point out Van Gogh's Starry Night is such a beautiful work to be able to break down the mechanics of composition and balance and talk about movement. And one of my favorite projects to do with students is to use that as a template, and then they make a parody where they're changing up some elements, but it's like, okay, we need something tall here where the cypress is and everything. So I love that, but I also absolutely adore the sunflowers. And I know he made multiple sunflowers, and I like all of them. I like the ones where there's a little bit more contrast compared to the ones where it's like still the yellowy orange background. You know what I'm talking about? But the way that he was drawn to sunflowers, not the beautiful, delicate roses, but like the rough, overlooked, the downtrodden, like that's how I see Van Gogh. Like as I've read the narratives, he was the kind of guy who felt comfortable with people who were a little bit down and out. And he saw the good and he saw the beauty in the marginalized and the overlooked. And, I am the type of person who always loves an underdog. And so the fact that he, in the sunflowers, is sort of the champion of the underdog flowers, I've always loved that, because they're not the conventionally beautiful, but they are beautiful. I'm curious, what about you? You've certainly done your fair share of research. What's your favorite work? Is there a piece that, or if I could really put you on the spot, is there a piece that really helped to secure his legacy that Jo was sort of putting out there in the early days that started to gain some recognition? Either one would be interesting to me.
All right, I just tucked your last question in the back of my thought, just to think about for a minute. I'll share that my favorite Van Gogh painting is Almond Blossom. And the reason why, I mean, much like you have a story, the reason why is because I think I also really related to Jo as a young mom of a child. And that painting, for your listeners, just to remind them, Almond Blossom has this gorgeous blue background with these limbs and twigs of this tree that are all in pink and white blossom. It's springtime, and Vincent painted that right after Theo and Jo's son was born, who was named after him, Vincent. And so to me, it felt like an olive branch. Like I get it. That you have your own family, and Jo's new, and I want her to know that that I welcome all of this for my dear brother Theo. And so that remained a favorite of Jo's. So I think that just sort of caught in my mind. And then regarding your last question, whether there was any painting that really broke through, let's see.
I mean, I know you had talked about the series of works, that the drawings for Emile Bernard, but I'm just wondering if there was like a specific work that really helped to launch him, the way that, like, I'm thinking of like American Gothic basically made Grant Wood almost overnight when it was, acquired by the Art Institute, when it was first exhibited and stuff like that. I'm just curious, was there one or was it a slow progression?
I really think it was a slow progression. I mean, he had different paintings that sparked a lot of interest. Like it's a pen and ink called Fountain in the Garden of the Asylum, which was one of Theo's favorites, and it was a drawing that Jo sent to the first exhibition with Octave Moss. I mentioned him before, which turned out to be a really terrific relationship because this guy really supported her in a lot of ways. Now, she didn't give that to him and he didn't sell it, but it was a focal point of conversation. And so I guess I'm equating it to, walking through a gallery and it's something that you pause and look at.
Yeah.
And so she ultimately took that back and she had it hanging in her own home. And I think she was averse to selling it because it was Theo's favorite. But that was something that Octave Moss used after an initial showing in Brussels. He had that same show with her permission go to the Modern Museum in Brussels and then into Paris. And so that was him endorsing Van Gogh. And so that was one of her early supporters that continued to support her throughout the years. So I guess that's the one that comes to mind. Not exactly what you asked for, but I think it was a focal point at an important time.
Well, I mean, and there's not always one piece that breaks the levees or whatever, and it's all going from there. But an early seal of approval and the introduction to the various tastemakers as this piece goes to exhibitions. I cannot speak today. As this piece goes to exhibitions, in different cities, I think that sounds like it fits the bill, and kudos to you for having that off the top of your head. But I do want to say once again, just to wrap it up, a big thank you very much, Joan Fernandez, author of Saving Vincent, a novel about Jo van Gogh, in your favorite bookstores starting April 15th. And check the links in the show notes because this is well worth the read. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. So much fun. I appreciate you, Kyle.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.